History is shaped by leadership, by the men who rise to power, who hold the weight of a nation on their shoulders, and whose decisions ripple across generations. We celebrate the great ones: Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt. But there is another list, a darker list, a list of presidents whose failures didn't just stain their reputations. They changed America, often for the worse. These are failures that ignited wars, expanded slavery, wrecked economies, shattered public trust, and pushed the country toward collapse. Each of these presidents believed they were doing the right thing. Some were overwhelmed by crisis, some were stubborn to the point of destruction, some were corrupt, and some were simply unprepared. Tonight, we journey through the stories of 10 leaders who left deep scars on the American legacy. This is the story of the 10 worst presidents in American history. 12. James K. Polk, 1845 to 1849. The expansionist who fueled a war. James K. Polk is often remembered as the manifest destiny president. He had a vision: stretch America from the Atlantic to the Pacific, fulfill the dream of a continental nation. But achieving that dream came at an enormous human cost. Polk's most controversial action was the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. Polk believed that the U.S. had a divine right to expand its borders. He provoked Mexico by sending troops into disputed territory along the Rio Grande, territory Mexico considered its own. When a clash broke out, Polk declared war, calling it defending American honor and territory. The war itself was brutal. Over 13,000 American soldiers died, many from disease rather than battle. Mexican casualties were far higher. Estimates suggest 25,000 to 50,000 deaths. Towns and cities were burned, civilians displaced, and entire regions destabilized. Polk's war accomplished territorial expansion. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo added California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming to the U.S. This doubled the size of the nation. But there was a dark side. The new territories reignited fierce national debates over slavery expansion. The Missouri Compromise line no longer applied, fueling sectional tension that pushed the nation closer to civil war. Polk's aggressive tactics set a precedent for military adventurism, raising questions about presidential power and war-making authority. Polk left office proud of his achievements. The nation had grown larger than ever before. But historians argue he left a nation divided and bloodied, with the seeds of future conflict sown in his territorial ambition. Polk's legacy is a cautionary tale. Ambition can expand a nation, but it can also cost lives and deepen divisions. 11. Martin Van Buren, 1837 to 1841. The president who couldn't stop the panic. Martin Van Buren entered the presidency following the dynamic Andrew Jackson, inheriting both the popularity and the problems of his predecessor. What he didn't inherit, however, was stability. The Panic of 1837, a devastating financial crisis, struck just months after Van Buren took office. Banks across the nation collapsed. Credit evaporated. Land values plummeted. Businesses failed, leaving thousands of Americans unemployed. Van Buren's response was cautious, almost painfully slow. He believed in limited government intervention. He refused to directly bail out banks or provide relief to struggling citizens. Instead, he proposed the independent treasury system, a plan to separate government funds from private banks, a system that took years to fully implement. Meanwhile, the American people were suffering. Farmers lost their lands. Laborers went without work or wages. Families struggled to buy food or shelter. Critics dubbed him Martin van Ruin, a cruel nickname that reflected the desperation felt across the nation. Van Buren's presidency exposed a central tension in American politics. Should the government intervene in times of economic crisis? Or should it stay hands-off and hope for natural recovery? Van Buren chose inaction, and millions paid the price. By 1840, he was politically crippled. The Whig Party, sensing an opportunity, elected William Henry Harrison, ending Van Buren's presidency in one term. History judges Van Buren as competent but indecisive, a man who faced one of the greatest economic crises in U.S. history and failed to act decisively. 10. John Tyler, 1841 to 1845. The President Without a Party. John Tyler became president only because William Henry Harrison died 31 days into office. Tyler was suddenly thrust into the highest office, and the country quickly realized he wasn't ready. Congress despised him. Tyler opposed the Whig Party's key policies. When he vetoed the creation of a national bank, the Whigs revolted. In an unprecedented move, they expelled him from the party entirely, a sitting U.S. president, abandoned by his own party. His cabinet resigned. Congress blocked his initiatives. The government ground to a halt. Tyler spent his presidency isolated and bitter. But perhaps the worst part of Tyler's legacy comes after he left office. As tensions escalated, Tyler sided openly with the Confederacy. He won a seat in the Confederate House of Representatives, though he died before taking office. A former president of the United States, actively supporting the destruction of the United States. John Tyler's presidency didn't end with leadership. It ended with betrayal. 9. Millard Fillmore, 1850 to 1853. The president who tried to save the Union by destroying its soul. Millard Fillmore stepped into office during a nation boiling with conflict over slavery. He made a decision that pushed America closer to disaster. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a law so harsh it set the entire North on fire. This law did not just strengthen slavery, it nationalized it. Free states were required to help capture runaway slaves. Northern citizens could be fined or imprisoned for refusing. Black Americans could be kidnapped with little evidence. Judges were paid more to rule for slaveholders. Fillmore insisted he was preventing civil war. He believed compromise would keep the Union intact. He couldn't have been more wrong. The North erupted. Abolitionists denounced him. States passed laws challenging the federal government. The Fugitive Slave Act radicalized the North, emboldened the South, and deepened the divide that made the Civil War inevitable. Fillmore left office despised by both sides. He tried to save the country by sacrificing morality. He failed at both. 8. George W. Bush, 2001 to 2009. The president who entered crisis and created new ones. The early days of George W. Bush's presidency were defined by the September 11th attacks. Millions supported the president, but what followed reshaped the world. The defining decision was the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The justification? Weapons of mass destruction. But the intelligence was flawed. The claims were unverified. The war began anyway. The consequences were devastating. More than 4,000 American troops killed, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians dead. A power vacuum that gave rise to ISIS. A war cost estimated in trillions, and the weapons? They were never found. But Iraq wasn't the only disaster. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck. Government response was slow, confused, and unprepared. Images of suffering became symbols of leadership failure. Then came the 2008 financial crisis, the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression. While not solely Bush's fault, the crisis grew from policies that allowed risky lending and deregulation to spiral. His presidency began with unity, but ended with deep division, global instability, and a shattered economy. 7. Ulysses S. Grant, 1869 to 1877. The war hero who couldn't win the war against corruption. Ulysses S. Grant is a legend on the battlefield, but in the White House he discovered a different kind of battlefield. Grant's fatal flaw? Loyalty. He trusted people too easily. His presidency became engulfed in scandal. The whiskey ring, a criminal conspiracy stealing millions in tax revenue. Grant's own private secretary was implicated. The credit mobiliary scandal, members of Congress accepted bribes from a railroad company. The Indian ring, government agents stole supplies meant for Native American reservations. Through it all, Grant remained personally honest. He fought for civil rights. He crushed the Ku Klux Klan. He protected black voters. But corruption drowned out his achievements. It destroyed his credibility and weakened Reconstruction. Grant was a brilliant general, but a naive president. 6. Richard Nixon, 1969 to 1974. The president who fell to his own paranoia. Richard Nixon was intelligent, cunning, deeply ambitious, and deeply suspicious. He opened relations with China, advanced environmental protection, and won a historic re-election. But beneath the surface was a darkness, a paranoia so consuming it became his downfall. Watergate. It began with a burglary. Behind it was a network of illegal wiretaps, political sabotage, abuse of the FBI, CIA, and IRS cover-ups from the Oval Office. When journalists exposed the scandal, the White House denied everything. When investigators got close, Nixon fired them. But then came the tapes. Secret Oval Office recordings revealed the truth. The president had conspired to obstruct justice and abuse power. Facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned. He left the White House in disgrace. Watergate shattered Americans' trust in government. His name remains synonymous with scandal. 5. Franklin Pierce, 1853 to 1857. The president who poured fuel on a nation in flames. Franklin Pierce promised unity when America was cracking apart over slavery. He was weak, indecisive, and easily manipulated. His greatest catastrophe was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This law allowed new territories to choose slavery, overturning decades of stability. Thousands of pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas. They came with guns. Bleeding Kansas was born, a violent conflict where towns were burned and families murdered. And Pierce, he did nothing. He refused to intervene. He sided with pro-slavery forces. His passivity emboldened the South, enraged the North, and shattered hope of compromise. During his presidency, the Whig Party collapsed and the Republican Party was born. Franklin Pierce didn't intend to destroy national unity, but weakness in times of crisis is as dangerous as malice. 4. Warren G. Harding, 1921 to 1923. The president who let corruption run wild. Warren G. Harding wanted to be loved. He surrounded himself with the worst people imaginable, the Ohio Gang. The scandals were endless. The Veterans Bureau scandal. Charles Forbes stole millions meant for wounded WWI veterans. The Justice Department scandal. Attorney General Harry Daugherty allowed criminals to buy immunity. The Teapot Dome scandal. The biggest political scandal until Watergate. Oil reserves for the U.S. Navy were handed to private companies in exchange for bribes. Harding didn't mastermind these crimes. He simply failed to control the vultures around him. He confessed, "My friends, they're the ones who keep me walking the floor at night." Harding died in office before the scandals fully exploded. His reputation collapsed. A president judged by the catastrophic failures of those he empowered. 3. Herbert Hoover, 1929 to 1933. The president who watched the economy collapse and stood still. Herbert Hoover entered the White House with a reputation as a miracle worker. But when the stock market crashed in 1929, Hoover froze. America was in freefall. The nation needed bold action. But Hoover believed in a rigid philosophy: the government should not interfere. He believed the crisis would correct itself. It didn't. The Great Depression spiraled. 9,000 banks failed. Unemployment soared to 25%. Families scavenged for food. Hoovervilles, shanty towns of the homeless, appeared. Bonus Army marched peacefully for promised bonuses. Hoover called in the U.S. Army. Tanks and cavalry attacked the veterans, burning their camp. It was a national disgrace. Hoover left office humiliated. His failure was ideological. He clung to a philosophy that collapsed under reality, and millions paid the price. 2. Andrew Johnson, 1865 to 1869. The president who destroyed Reconstruction. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson stepped in. His mission: rebuild the South, protect freed slaves, and unify the nation. Instead, Johnson took the greatest opportunity for justice and shattered it. He opposed black rights from the start. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act and the Freedmen's Bureau Bill. He believed African Americans were inferior. He believed states should control racial laws. He pardoned thousands of ex-Confederate leaders. They regained power across the South. Southern states passed black codes, laws that recreated slavery under another name. Congress tried to stop him. They overrode his vetoes. Johnson raged against them. Congress impeached him, the first impeachment of a U.S. president. He survived removal by one vote. Under Johnson, Reconstruction crumbled. White supremacist violence exploded. The seeds of segregation were planted. Andrew Johnson actively worked against justice during the most important civil rights moment in U.S. history. 1. James Buchanan, 1857 to 1861. The president who watched the Union split apart. James Buchanan inherited a nation on the verge of fracture. He left it in civil war. As Southern states began to secede, Buchanan did nothing. He claimed he had no constitutional power to stop them. He was indecisive, weak, and paralyzed. His inaction gave the Confederacy time to organize and arm itself. He supported the pro-slavery Supreme Court ruling in the Dred Scott case, which declared black people were not citizens and could not sue for freedom. When the nation needed a leader to hold it together, Buchanan offered only legalistic hand-wringing. He watched as the Union split apart. His failure of leadership made the Civil War not only possible, but inevitable. He is often ranked as the worst president for his catastrophic inaction at the nation's most critical hour. Honorable mentions, a few other notable failures. Zachary Taylor, 1849 to 1850. Though his death cut his term short, he threatened to use military force against Southern secessionists, a stance that might have altered history. His early death places him here. Jimmy Carter, 1977 to 1981. A good man faced with stagflation and the Iran hostage crisis. His inability to manage these crises effectively led to a perception of weak leadership. What makes a president one of the worst? Looking back, it becomes clear. Presidential failure doesn't come from one mistake. It comes from a pattern of arrogance, paralysis, corruption, cowardice, or simply being the wrong leader at the wrong time. Some were overwhelmed, some were unethical, some were stubborn, some were tragically unprepared. But all of them failed the nation when it needed them most. Because the presidency is more than a job, it is a test of judgment, of character, of courage, and of leadership under fire. And when a president fails, the consequences echo for generations.